Hi everyone, my name is Jamie Hendricks, and I'm going to be your instructor for your next few weeks of your SAT and ACT prep course. This video is an information session regarding the SAT and ACT tests, how it fits into Bright Futures, and how it fits into your college education. So first of all, the SAT and ACT are a test, and it is only a test. It is not something that's going to determine your entire future or how your life is going to go from here on out. So please, please, please stop stressing too much over this. The SAT, let's talk a little bit about what these tests are, who makes them, and the motivation behind them. The SAT is put out by a company called College Board. Now, College Board has been around since the 1920s. They are a not-for-profit education organization, and they believe that they have put out like the perfect test. Well, we all know there's no such thing as the perfect test. The ACT, by contrast, let's talk a little bit about ACT, who and what they are. Now, the ACT is another option for your standardized testing. The ACT is put out by a company called ACT. They're not real creative, and they are out of Des Moines, Iowa. The ACT has been around in the same format since 1959. By contrast, the SAT has completely switched formats just since I've been doing this in the last 15 years, 4 times. The SAT is a moving target, so we have to really work hard to keep up with it. Your ACT, again, by contrast, has been in the same format since 1959, so we have a wealth of data on this booger and know how to study for it. As far as which test is more popular, it just depends on where you live. The ACT is put out by, again, the company called ACT. They're out of Des Moines, Iowa, and they are a strictly non-for-profit organization. They only do 2 things. The only things that the ACT company does is that they put out the ACT and they compile academic statistics for anyone who wants to study them. Sounds like a fantastic job. All right, so let's talk a little bit about what these tests don't do. The SAT and ACT, they do not measure your IQ. They are not a good measure of your intelligence. They are not a good measure of what you've learned in school. And they definitely are not a good measure of how well you're going to do in college. Now, more and more colleges are recognizing this. Several states, including California, Colorado, and most recently Illinois, have completely actually given up taking these tests as entrance exams for their state colleges. They just simply don't want you to submit the scores at all. I think several states, more states will follow in the coming years. There are, in addition to those 3 states, there are also over 1,200 colleges nationwide that are what are called test optional. And I think the only one in Florida that's test optional is Florida Southern. All of your state schools in Florida still require either your SAT or ACT scores to be submitted. So that's what these tests don't do. Again, they're not a good measure of your intelligence. They're not a good measure of how well you do in school, etc., etc. Let's look at what these tests do. These tests make your brain work differently. And here's an example of how they make your brain work differently. So let's look at this example that's in the middle of the page here. So the first bullet point, now this is a normal test question. So this is a normal test question you may have seen in school at some point in your academic life. The scores for 5 students on a recent exam were 84, 89, 71, 92, and 84. What was the average score? Okay, so hopefully most of you know how to find an average. This should be pretty much a bada bing, bada boom kind of thing. You're going to add up all those numbers, divide by 5, boom, you're done. Piece of cake, finding an average. Now, here's your working backwards question. This type of question would be an easy question on your ACT. It would never be found on your SAT. The average score on an exam was 84. The scores for the 4 students were 84, 71, 92, and 84. What was the 5th guy's score? Now this one's a little harder, but we could do it. We're only missing one thing. We're just missing the 5th guy's score. So we can add up the 4 we have, and then do plus x on the top, divide by 5, equals 84. So we have a number plus x, the whole thing over 5 equals 84. We have an equation. We can solve for x with a little bit of algebra and actually be able to work that out. Not so bad. Your bottom example here is your thinking differently question. This could show up on either your SAT or your ACT test. The average score on an exam was 84. If the scores for 3 of the students were 84, 71, and 92, what was the sum of the remaining 2 students' scores? That's a little harder. Okay, that's going to make your brain work differently. Your brain goes, ooh, I'm missing 2 things. I'm missing 2 student scores. But did they ask for the 2 student scores? No. They only want the sum. So they only want one thing. So again, really you're only missing one thing. But it tricks your brain into thinking that you're missing 2. So in order to solve this problem, which we'll actually do in the math portion of the program, you just have to make your brain work a little differently and go, really, I'm only missing one thing, even though the question is trying to trick me into thinking that I'm missing 2. And we'll solve that when we do the math portion of the program. But I hope that this example shows you how these tests make your brain work differently and how you have to think a little differently in order to solve these problems. So that's what these tests make you do. They make you think differently. Now, everybody's brain can think differently and work differently. It just takes time and effort. Excuse me. Okay, so let's cover some myths versus realities when it comes to these tests. These are all things that I've had people say to me that I've either had to prove or disprove. So myth number 1, the SAT and ACT is a test of my intelligence, and my scores are a good indication of how well I do in college. Well, we've already talked about that. That's total shenanigans. Absolutely not. I have had students score near perfect scores, 1580, on the SAT, and then wound up dropping out of college because they couldn't handle it. I've had students barely break 1,000 and then excel in school. And again, we're seeing more and more colleges that are also recognizing this fact. Myth number 2 is that the SAT and ACT test complex math concepts. Absolutely not. There are nothing on these tests above Algebra 2. There's a little bit of basic trig with sine, cosine, and tangent, basic SOHCAHTOA kind of stuff. And that is stuff that actually you guys learn in either Algebra 2 or Geometry, depending upon which school you attend. So there's nothing on these tests above Algebra 2. Myth number 3, you can't really improve your reading score. I have no idea where this one comes from, but I keep hearing it. Of course you can improve your reading score. There are 3 ways to improve your reading score. The first one is very boring, and that is to practice those awful boring passages. Okay, so the first one is just the boring, you got to practice. The second way to improve your reading score is to improve your vocabulary score. Okay, so to improve your vocab. So parents, when we took this test, we had to memorize thousands upon thousands of words and definitions. Thank God, kids, you don't have to do that anymore. The way we improve your vocab score now is that you have to improve your skill that's called words in context. All of the vocab questions are now word in context vocabulary. So that means you have to practice getting the meaning of the word you don't know from the word clues, the context clues around it. The best way to do that is by reading something where you're going to encounter words that you don't know and practice getting the meaning of the word you don't know from the context clues around it. So the good news is that you can read anything you want to read as long as you're encountering words you don't know. So read something that you're interested in. If you're interested in medicine, read medical journals. You're going to encounter words you don't know. If you're interested in mechanics, read popular mechanics. Read anything you're interested in as long as you're encountering words you don't know. And then try to figure out that word or the words around it, and then look up the word and see if you're right. That's how you're going to improve that word in context vocabulary score. So that's the second way to improve your reading score, is word in context vocabulary. The third way to improve your reading score is actually not reading, it's grammar. Well, we don't teach grammar in the state of Florida. So most of my students come to me with very low grammar scores. So the way we fix that is simply by teaching you some grammar rules. And we'll pull up your reading score just by teaching you basic grammar. All right, so that's myth number 3. Myth number 4 is better to leave a question blank than to guess. Not anymore. Now, this used to be true. Before 2016, on your SAT, there was a penalty for getting a question wrong. They used to subtract points from your score. After 2016, there is no penalty on either test, SAT or ACT, for guessing. So by all means, make sure you answer every single question on both tests, your SAT and ACT. Myth number 5, men do better on the SAT, women do better on the ACT. This is actually sort of true. It depends on the time frame you look at. So for your SAT, if you look back over the last 50 years, men have absolutely done better on the SAT than women. Now, let's think about that. Why would that be? Of course, 50 years ago, men had better access to education at that point, especially in the STEM areas, in the science and math. So they're going to do better on your SAT. than women would. There was also a lot of gender bias in the SAT at that point. So again, men scored higher. Now, if we look back over the last 5 years, that point gap has significantly narrowed. In fact, in 2020, the average men's scores on the reading section was 9 points lower than the women's, and the men's math score was 15 points higher. So, and when we're talking about a 1,600-point test, 9 points, 15 points, that's not statistically significant. So, kudos to College Board for taking the gender bias out of the test, and go women for getting those STEM, for doing better in the STEM areas. Okay, so that's your SAT. As far as your ACT goes, it's always been pretty much neck and neck since 1959. There really has not been a statistically significant difference in ACT scores between men and women. So either gender is fine as far as your ACT goes throughout history. Okay, so why should you take the SAT or the ACT? Basically, you know why you have to take it. In the state of Florida, if you're going to a Florida State school, if you want bright futures, you need to take the test. How much does it count towards your college admission? Okay, well, a lot and not that much. It depends on where you're going. Okay, if you're going out of state and you're applying to somewhere in one of those states where they don't accept the test, California, Colorado, Illinois, it doesn't matter. They're not accepting the test. Okay, but if you're applying somewhere in the state of Florida or you're going for bright futures, it counts a lot to those Florida State schools. Most of you are probably going somewhere in the state of Florida, so it's going to count a lot towards your college admission. Now, in general, the general rule is that the bigger the school, the more it's going to count towards your college admission. So let's think about why would that be. Let's just think about this logically. The larger schools get thousands upon thousands of applications. What's an easy way to sort those applications? With a number. You either make the cut or you don't. You go in one pile or the other. So in order to be in the right pile, you got to have the right number. Okay? Now, there are things that can offset that number. Okay? Extracurricular activities, leadership, volunteer hours, all of those things can help offset that SAT or ACT score. But you still have to at least make the minimum in order to be in the right pile. So hopefully that makes sense. But again, the bigger the school, the more it's going to count. Your smaller schools do have more time to look at the overall package that you bring to that school and say, she missed our cutoff by 10 points, but look at all of her activities. Look at her job experience. Look at the volunteer hours she puts in. We don't care that she missed it by 10 points. We're still going to take her. The smaller schools have the opportunity to do that. Schools like FGCU, Florida Gulf Coast, Northern Florida, those smaller type schools will take the time to do that. Your big schools, FSU, USF, any combination of the letters US and F that you can put together in the state, also UF up in Gainesville, they're not going to have the time to do that. They have thousands upon thousands of applications. They're not going to be looking at each individual like that. You either make the cut or you don't. Okay, so that's a little bit about how much it counts. How are your tests structured? I'm not going to go through this a whole lot because, again, you guys can read through this and just see how it goes together. Time-wise, their tests are about the same. Your SAT test sections are in order. Your ACT test sections are out of order so that you can compare apples to apples. So your readings are together, your English and writing and language are together. Your English section for your ACT, your writing and language section for your SAT, those are both grammar. Okay, I don't care what they want to call them. They're both grammar sections where they basically give you sentences and you gotta, correct the errors. The math sections on the tests are a little bit different. On the left, you have your SAT here. You have two different math sections. You have a non-calculator and a calculator section. You also have these lovely grid-in questions that everybody loves on your SAT. On your ACT, it's only one section. It's section 2. It's 60 minutes. It's 60 questions. It's all multiple choice, so you don't have the grid-ins, and it's all calculator-based. Your science section. Okay, so there's no science section on your SAT. There is a science section on your ACT. Let's talk about that because that's kind of the elephant in the room when it comes to your ACT test. The science section isn't really science, guys. It's reading comprehension with a science base. Okay. I've had 2 questions in 15 years where I had to have outside science knowledge in order to be able to answer those questions. And of course, they were biology questions, which, me being engineer and physics based, meant I couldn't answer them and had to look them up. But those were the only 2 questions in 15 years where I had to have outside science knowledge. Otherwise, everything I always needed to know was either in the passage or in the charts, graphs, and tables that they gave me in the passage itself. Most of your science questions are going to be based on charts, graphs, and tables. It's all about reading the charts, graphs, and tables and interpreting data. Okay, that's your science section. As far as the essay goes, the essay on your SAT is no longer offered. There is an optional essay on your ACT. My advice to you is that if you're going to take the ACT, at some point, take the optional essay. It does not affect your score in any way, shape, or form. It's completely scored separately. But the reason you want to do it at some point is that there are some private schools that still require it. And there are some private scholarships that require it. But it's kind of a checkbox. It's just a did you do it? So if you've done it, you can check the box. Yeah, hey, I did it. It's over. You don't have to knock it out of the park. You just need to have done it at some point. And your ACT essay is not going to be particularly difficult. It's going to be, like, is cheating wrong in school? Why or why not? Defend your position. It's not going to be that hard of an essay. So it's a good idea to go ahead and do it once, have that box checked, so that if you need it for a scholarship or a private school application, it's already done and you don't have to worry about it again. Now, having said that, if you're going into journalism, you absolutely need to do it and you need to do well on it. If you're in that situation, please let me know and we're going to get you to somebody who specializes in that area. Okay. SAT and ACT, let's talk about the differences between the tests. Most of you guys have had some sort of experience with the SAT or PSAT at this point, so you kind of have an idea of what the SAT looks like, but again, that ACT is kind of a foreign animal to most of you guys. So let's talk about the differences between the two. ACT questions tend to be more straightforward in most people's opinions. Now, this is especially true in your math section. So let's talk about the difference between the math questions. On your SAT, your questions are going to be really wordy, and you're going to have to spend some time cutting through the fluff to figure out exactly what they really want you to do with this problem. But once you figure out what they want you to do, what they actually want you to do may not be that hard. On your ACT, what you have to do on the math problem is going to be crystal clear, but what you have to do might be a little harder. So you have to decide, where do you want to spend your time? Do you want to spend your time cutting through the fluff to figure out what you have to do? Or do you want to spend your time actually solving the problem? One isn't necessarily better than the other, but your brain is going to like one better than the other. Okay, and we don't know which one your brain is going to like better until you've tried both tests. So we'll talk more about that in a minute. Your second difference is that your SAT has a stronger emphasis on vocabulary. Now, this used to be really obvious. If you look at some of the older tests, it's blatantly obvious that the SAT reading passages are much wordier and harder to get through than the ACT. If you look at tests within the last year and a half or so, since about, since the pandemic started, March or April of 2020, you're going to see that the two tests are starting to level out in terms of the vocabulary. I'm not sure if the SAT is coming down or the ACT is coming up, but they're starting to level out in terms of the vocab. So not as much of a difference now as there used to be, but there's still a slight difference between the two. All right, number 3, the ACT has that science section and the SAT does not. Again, we've kind of talked about this. The science section isn't science. The science section is reading comprehension with a science base. So it's not that bad. However, if you're one of these people that is absolutely like, oh my God, I can't handle science. Like I took earth science and I took no other science because I didn't know what to do with it. Then the ACT might not be the right test for you because we don't want to have you panicking during a section. Difference number 4. The ACT tests more advanced math concepts, but your SAT has that non-calculator math section. So you have to decide how glued to your calculator are you. If your calculator, if you're super glued to that calculator, your ACT is probably going to be a better option. But if you're like, I don't really care about the calculator that much, your SAT is okay. Now, when we say that the ACT tests more advanced math concepts, what we're talking about is that it has more of an emphasis on geometry and has more of an emphasis on Algebra 2. Not that it covers anything higher than that. Okay, so we're still only dealing with Algebra 2 and geometry. We're not going above that. Okay. But if you're in the boat where you're a senior and you're taking Algebra 2 as a senior, then I would steer you more toward the SAT. Number 5, your ACT is more of a big picture exam. Okay, so your SAT gives you 2 scores. You have your reading score and your math score. If you have a huge disparity between those, say if you have like a 100-point gap or more between your SAT, between your reading and your math on your SAT, then you need to stick with the SAT. Okay, and the reason is that's going to allow you to show a college where you shine. You may be like, listen, I'm horrible at math, but I'm really amazing at English and reading, and I want to be a writer. So they're not going to care as much about your math score. They're just going to be looking at that English and reading score if you want to be a writer. So, you have to use decent on the math, but if you have that like 100-point gap or so between the two, you need to stick with the SAT so you can really show the college where you shine. Now, if you're a relatively well-rounded student and your scores between your math and your reading are relatively close, you really need to consider your ACT. For your ACT, as long as you do well in all 4 sections, science, math, reading, and grammar, then you're going to have a good overall composite score. Because on your ACT, although you get scores for each section, the only score that's reported to a college is your overall or composite score. So you only get 1 score reported to the college. So you have to do well in all 4 sections in order for your ACT to really work for you. Okay, so bottom line down here at the bottom of the page, I really recommend for you to take both tests. Okay, your brain is going to prefer one test over the other, but we don't know which one you're going to like better until you've taken both. Now, once you've taken both of them once, you can use part 4 of what I sent you, which is this SAT and ACT chart, to figure out which one your brain would prefer. So let's say you've taken both tests, and let's say your SAT score is an 1100. Okay, so your SAT score is here on your y-axis, your vertical axis. So let's say you scored an 1100 on your SAT. But let's say on your ACT you scored a 27. So let's chart that. Your ACT is on the horizontal axis, the left-right. So here's 27 here in 1100, and let's look at where they meet. Well, they meet over here in the red zone. So if you're in the red zone, then your brain favors your ACT, and that's the test that you should focus on. So once you've taken them each once, you chart it, and you go, boom, I favor ACT, I'm going to do that. But again, let's say you took an 1100 on your SAT, but you only got a 15 on your ACT. Well, now if we chart that, now you're over here in the blue area, and your brain favors your SAT. So again, once you've taken them both once, chart it, see where they meet. If you're in the blue, stick with your SAT. If you're in the red, stick with your ACT. If you're in this gray zone where it says judgment call, sorry about your luck, guys. That means your brain doesn't know which one it likes better. And you kind of have the option of which test did you feel better about. Testing is a very emotional thing. If you have a test where you're like, I really hated the SAT, I hated that, then go with your ACT and just stick with that one, or vice versa. If you didn't feel strongly about one over the other, then keep trying both until you get the score you need. Okay, so that's my advice. All right, back to part 1. Now, let's talk about scoring. All right, well, this gets a little convoluted. Don't shoot the messenger. So your SAT scores are reported on the scale from 200 to 800. So basically you get 200 points for putting your name on the paper. So you've got 2 different sections. You have your what you call your ERWB, which is your reading and grammar sections, which combine to make your evidence-based reading and writing score. And then you have your two math sections, your calculator and your non-calculator, then that gives you your math score. Okay. All right, so, in a second, let me see if I can move this window. There we go. Okay. So with the scoring, the way this works is they're going to take your raw score. Your raw score is the number you got right in a section, and they're going to scale it up to something between 200 and 800 using a basic proportion. Nothing crazy there, just some normal math, no big deal. Now, once they do that, once they scale it up between 200 and 800 for both sections, for your reading and for your math, then College Board is going to apply something called equating. All right, this is where things get weird. So in this equating process, equating is some sort of statistical analysis that College Board does that's supposed to level out all the tests, because we know that some tests are harder than others. And this is supposed to level them out and make them so that they're about equal and make it kind of a level playing field. Now, the problem with equating is that it's some sort of statistical analysis that they won't tell us about and don't publish. That's where the problem is. So we don't know what they're doing or how they're doing it. But here's the end result. Basically what they do is they look at the test that you take. So you guys are, if you're taking the free one for juniors, you're taking it in March. So they're going to look at that test that you're taking in March, and they're going to look at all the tests that they've given so far that academic year. So they're going to look at all the tests that they've given since August, and they're going to look at all the tests that they're going to give for the rest of the year, so all the way through May. And they're going to decide if that test that they're giving to you in March is easier or harder than all of those other tests. If they think it's easier, they're going to subtract points from your score. If they think it's harder, they're going to add points to your score. Now, the number that they add or subtract is based on this equating statistical analysis thing that they do that they don't publish and won't tell us about, and we don't know how they do it. So that's where I have a problem with that. Now, how we figure out what the equating is for a test is you find someone like me who has no life. And I'm a member of 8 million different message boards on Reddit. And if you don't know what Reddit is, it's probably a good thing. But it's a dark hole of the internet. So you have to find somebody who's a member of 8 million tutor boards, and you find a kid that only missed one. When you find somebody that only missed one question, you got to find out what their score was. So let's say this kid that only missed one got a 1540. That tells me that the equating is a minus 60. Okay. If that kid that only missed one still got a perfect score, then I know that the equating is either 0 or that they're adding. I never know how much they're adding, but if they are subtracting, we can at least figure that out. So that's how we figure out what the equating is, unfortunately. Until we get somebody that defects from College Board. When somebody defects from College Board, then we'll know how they calculate equating. We're still waiting for that defector. So that's a little bit about equating and how scoring works. Unfortunately, equating seems to be quite subjective because, again, they're basing it not only on tests that they've already given that they have data for, that part I'm okay with, but they're also basing it on tests that they haven't given yet. So they don't have data for that. And that's where I think the issues lie. Now, again, that's just something we have to deal with as far as College Board goes. We don't have an option on, on how to deal with equating. If you call them and ask them about equating, they read you this blurb that's right here. Now, this blurb is a little bit about equating that's on their website. But if you call College Board and ask them about equating, they'll read you that blurb. If you ask for their supervisor and ask about equating, they read you the blurb. If you email them and ask them about equating, they send you the blurb. You can't get anywhere with them when it comes to equating and explaining it. So that's College Board and equating. Again, just something we have to deal with. Let's talk about super scoring. So super scoring is a wonderful thing. Super scoring is something that College Board does for us that we are happy about. Basically, what super scoring is that if you take the test multiple times, they're going to take your highest reading score and your highest math score and put it together to make your super score. So we love that because that's working out in our favor. Now, not all colleges do super scoring. So all colleges in the state of Florida do super scoring, and super scoring counts towards your bright futures. So hooray for that. But if you're in a different state other than Florida, or if you're applying to colleges outside of the state of Florida, make sure that you ask the college, or any private college, make sure you ask them if you go on a tour or talking to admissions, do you accept super scoring? Because some do and some don't. Okay, how is your ACT scored? Okay, now compared to SAT, this is really, really easy, guys. All right, so your ACT, the way your ACT scores work is that they take your raw score. So say you got like 28 out of 40 correct on a section, and they're going to scale everything to 36. The magic number on your ACT is 36. I don't know why. That's just what they chose. So they're going to use a basic proportion, and I put it right here in the middle of the page. So if you got 28 out of 40 right, they're going to scale that to 36 using a basic proportion like this. And so your scaled score out of 36 for that section would be a 25.2. They're going to do that for all 4 sections. Okay, so your math, your reading, your grammar, and your science. And then to get your overall composite score, they simply take the average of those 4 numbers. So they're going to add your 4 sections together, divide by 4, boom, that's your ACT score. Done. Okay, very simple, very straightforward. Your science section on your ACT is curved. However, it is only curved over the students who took the same test on the same day, and it's a straight up bell curve, which means it can only help you, it'll never hurt you, and it's published, so we know what it is. It's usually not very much, though. It's usually only like 1 to 2 points, so don't count on it as far as saving your science score, because it's not going to happen. The ACT does do super scoring now. This is something new that they started doing in September of 2020. So they do super scoring. They have talked about doing sectional retakes. This was something they were planning on rolling out during the pandemic and then decided not to. So they haven't rolled this out yet, but they are talking about doing sectional retakes where you can sign up and just go in and like just take the math and science section, or just take English and science, or whatever you want, however many sections you want at a time. But they have not rolled that out yet, so we're still waiting on a date for that. But they do super scoring just like your SAT does, where if you take the ACT multiple times, they're going to take the best score out of each section, add those together, divide by 4 to get the average, and then that would be your new composite score. And again, just like with your SAT, your super scoring on your ACT also counts for your Bright Futures. Okay, average scores. So average score for the ACT. Your average score for your state of Florida, these are the 2019 and 2020 numbers. Where are my 2021 numbers? I put the 2021 numbers in here.